Well, it is certainly good this morning to look out and see so many here, and what a blessing. It is when we can be able to worship together in fellowship, to be able to study God's precious message, to be able to sing such wonderful songs. Jesus, our God, is truly our friend when we are faithful and true to Him. He is one who is our brother. If you love me and keep my commandments, you'll be my friend, John 15:14. And so as I mentioned last week, we are going to be looking at a series of lessons in which I've been preparing, and though with the pneumonia and stuff, we've had to kind of shift around, but nevertheless, we do find ourselves today looking at the question we were going to answer over this mini-series here on whether or not, with all the conflict between Israel and Palestine now, and Hamas in particular, that terrorist group there, of whether or not as Christians we are to support them from a biblical point of view, that being Israel in particular. You can't, at our current moment in time, Google or look up or go through social media without finding those who would tell us that as Christians it is demanded from a biblical point of view that we ought to support Israel. One article in particular, a preacher for whom I could not tell who he preached for, but nevertheless he was called a preacher. He would write this in an article entitled, "Reasons Why Christians Must Support Israel." In Genesis 12 and verse 3, the Lord says of Israel, "I will bless those who bless you, and curse you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the people of the earth will be blessed through you." I passionately believe this promise from God is as true today as it was centuries ago. Every other nation was founded by an act of human will, but Israel is unique in that it was established by an act of God. It was promised to Abraham by God in an eternal covenant. Genesis 17 and verse 8. The existence of Israel from its beginning is truly a miracle, and the fact that Israel exists to this day is a testament to the Lord's timeless promise. Another gentleman in an article similarly titled, Jack Hayford, would write this: "We live in a sobering moment in history. It calls us as believers in Jesus Christ to take a stand with Israel. Perhaps the most pointed statement regarding the importance of the Jews is from the lips of our Lord and Savior Himself in His conversion with the Samaritan woman recorded in John 4, 1 through 26. Jesus is very definitive. Salvation is of the Jews, verse 22. Now I would point out that we're not going to look at it this morning. That's not really a correct translation. Verse 22 says salvation is from the Jews. That would be a more accurate translation, meaning it would come forth from them. But obviously, and as I saw one man post, I cannot understand why preachers are not preaching on this every single day with the conflict going on in Israel, that Christians must biblically stand with Israel. Now, before we begin or continue in on this, I want to make this very clear. When we go through the Bible and we start examining these things, and the lessons we learn over the next several weeks, if it does come to be true that Christians are not required to stand with modern Israel, that does not mean that one must then therefore stand with Palestine. Just because the Bible might come to the conclusion that we as Christians don't have to stand with modern Israel, again, does not necessitate that we must therefore stand for Hamas or for Palestine in particular. We're just simply looking at and going to ask the question, what does the Bible say on this matter? Does it have a point of view in which we must, by all accounts, stand with Israel as Christians because they are God's chosen people? They were and are the promised people of an eternity. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at our first point this morning, Israel's biblical history. It is important that we understand the history that begat God's chosen people, the Israelites, and how God raised up this nation. Now, as I said, or as I read before from that one gentleman who said, well, God allowed all the other nations just to come up basically organically, but He personally raised up the Israelites. There is no doubt that God personally raised up the Israelites. Ezekiel and Jeremiah and all over the place from Genesis on, Genesis 12 on, we see this as a truth. That God did see this people who were bloody as a baby in a field and took care of them, Ezekiel says, or God told Ezekiel, and raised her up to be this great nation. But it is not true that He did not raise up other nations. The Assyrian nation He raised up to destroy the northern tribes of Israel. Babylon He raised up to destroy the southern kingdom of Israel. The Greek nation and the Roman nations we see in the book of Daniel, that He personally raised them up, including the Medo-Persians. Even Cyrus said God spoke to him personally to tell him what to do. Now, whether that was through prophet or through direct communication, we're not told. But nevertheless, God certainly has had a hand in other nations, raising them up and even bringing them down when necessary. But when it comes to the Israelites, they were without a doubt different than everyone else. Than every other nation God had a hand in. Because they were personally chosen by God to be His special people. In fact, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, God made a promise to Adam and Eve. After they had eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, after they had sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and had separated themselves in that sin from God, God, after explaining their punishment to them, He does make a promise to them and to all those who would come after them until the fullness of time. When He said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, talking to the serpent, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. God made a promise to Satan at that moment, and thus Adam and Eve as well, by implication, that He was going to send someone who would crush sin, who would crush Satan. And from that moment on, God, through miraculous and providential means, did what is commonly called the scheme of redemption, meaning He brought about, developed, and followed through with everything that would be necessary to bring that fullness of time, and when Christ would come, when that perfect moment in history here on earth would be at its perfect situation for Jesus to be born of woman under the law and be in the flesh. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of woman under the law. Now, in the process of creating that fullness of time, in the process of developing the many different things that would need to take place, the raising and lowering of nations, the family lineages that must be required, as we'll talk about next week in Israel's lineages through each tribe. God was doing amazing and wonderful things. And when it comes to Israel in particular, as you and I know, God made a promise to a certain man from Ur, a man named Abraham, or Abram at the time. And God asked him, coming to him, to pick up him and his family and go to a land that his ancestors would one day take hold of. In Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and in who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That promise began the fullness of time when it comes to the Israelites and the role in which they would play in God's scheme of redemption. How Abraham, who was without child at this time, would, with his wife Sarah, at some point have a child in whom all the earth would be blessed, that a nation would form from. And as you and I know, that came forth and was fulfilled while Abraham and Sarah were at the age of about 100 years old. In Genesis chapter 21, 1 through 2, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised, and Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Now, because man had had a few hiccups, there were some things here and there that took place, but God did exactly what he had promised. He established within Abraham one who would be and continue Abraham's lineage into a great nation, and God would throughout the book of Genesis, whether it be with Isaac or Jacob or his sons, continue to remind generation to generation the promise that he had made to Abraham, that he would make with him a great nation. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, we see that God had brought about through providential means, and we learn through Joseph, who had rose to that point in being the second in all the kingdom of the Egyptians, second only to Pharaoh. And of course, the drought took place, as you and I know, and his father and his family, who thought Joseph were dead, go to Egypt and seek some refuge. They heard, because God had blessed Joseph, that Egypt had food, that Egypt had supplies. And we know that interaction, and through that interaction, of course, Jacob and the rest of his family, they go to Egypt. They live there. Joseph dies, his father dies. Some generations pass away. And then there comes a king, we read here in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph and the great things he had done for Egypt, who had only seen that the Israelites, in some form or fashion, they were growing massively. Now there arose a king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." And thus we see the Israelites became slaves of Egypt. And for some 400 plus years, this is the case. God watched over them, and though Egypt and its pharaohs tried to destroy the Israelites and limit them, God continued to take care of them. We see ways in which that took place with even Moses, right? How Moses, when he was born, was sent off by his parents down the river, and Pharaoh's own daughter finds him and takes him in and raises him up, and of course gives him a life, and eventually, though of course he's really raised by his own mother, who providentially speaking, of course Moses' sister says, "Hey, I know this lady who can, a wet nurse who can take care of him and help you out, Pharaoh's daughter, and be that for him that he needs." And of course he learns all about God, and we know what takes place there. And God goes to him, Moses, after he's run away from Egypt, living in a land far away. And he tells him that I'm going to get my people out of Egypt, the nation I had promised your father Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The promise that I have said all these years, I'm going to allow them and take them to a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. A land there that Abraham had been buried in along with his wife. A land that previously was not full of iniquity yet. And they shall come back here from the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete during Abraham's day. But that point had come, hadn't it? And God, knowing that Canaan's sin was full, the Amorites and those who lived therein, the Palestinians and the Hittites and all of those that were there, Jericho and all the people there in Canaan, their iniquity had become full. And this, of course, is what God had mentioned to Abraham, that He would take him and that his family would one day come back, fourth generation, to the land of Canaan, that it would be theirs and they would have it. Now, as we know, the Israelites, that first generation, obviously didn't want that land enough. They grumbled and complained to God, and because of that, for 40 years, they wandered in the wilderness. But Joshua and Caleb, being the two spies who were not unfaithful, led, Joshua in particular, that next generation to the promised land. The land that God had said they would have. The nation would be what God had promised it to be. And in Joshua 21, verse 43 through 45, we see God's promise was fulfilled. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that He swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as He had sworn to their fathers. No one of all their enemies had withstood them. For the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Notice verse 45. Not one word of all the good promises the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Of King Solomon we read this to be true as well in 1 Kings 4:21. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms of the Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines, and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. This, of course, the borders, or some of them given by God. God had kept His promise. His promise to Abraham, that He would make him and his lineage a great nation, and that that nation would serve and be in the land, their God, the land that Abraham had moved to and had lived in, had died in. Every word of that promise was fulfilled. Every word happened exactly as the Lord said it would. And here you have the Israelites who had received that promise, who were living in the covenant that God had made with them. But we find that Israel's history, their biblical history, when we read God's Word concerning those promises, that those promises had provisions, and in biblical Israel's history, there was a contingent to the promise given by God. God had promised Abraham a nation from his lineage, and that they would possess that promised land, and they had certainly done so. God had even promised in the great sermon delivered by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 40, both a secondary promise and a contingent. Therefore you shall keep His statutes and His commandments, which I command to you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for all time. Now, some have gone here to Deuteronomy 4 and verse 40 and said that contingent in there of the first part, you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, that it may go well with you, say, well, there are two promises being made here. The first promise is a conditional promise, that God will bless them in the land as long as they keep his commandments. If they don't keep his commandments, then they simply will not be blessed in the land they live. And then there is, as one man put it, an unconditional promise here, and that is that they will be given that land for all time. And it's that part right there that has people saying, well, this is the reason we must, under all circumstances, from a biblical point of view, as Christians, we must support Israel. And if one might want to take that viewpoint here in Deuteronomy 4 and verse 40, I wouldn't argue with them, though I don't think it's grammatically accurate. And one of the reasons for that is this. This isn't the only verse where God puts a condition, a contingent on his promise. Joshua, after he had been given all that was promised, as we read, and had been seen the fulfillment of everything that God had done. We read this in Joshua 23, 15 through 16. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you, if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly, notice, from off the good land that he has given you. So the question then is, did Israel keep their end of the promise? Their end of the covenant they made to God to receive this promised land? Were they faithful and true? Or did they play the harlot, serve other gods? Now you and I know the history of Israel. Unfortunately, they were not faithful and true. Did they have their moments? Sure. Did they have their times? Most certainly. But the nation would not and continually broke God's covenant. To the point that Jeremiah 11 verse 10 would read this: they have turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers, who refused to hear my words. They have gone after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant that I made with their fathers. Now, don't get me wrong, God gave them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. He even, after the 70 years of captivity that would take place there in Babylon and towards the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire, brought back a remnant. We see in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and some of the minor prophets that this remnant came back. And though they had their struggles, and though they were trying to do what's right in many ways, and though the prophets like, again, Zechariah and Ezra and Nehemiah tried to keep them straight, and God would send them the other prophets to try to get them where they needed to be, by the time the fullness of time had come, and God became flesh and dwelt among us John 1:14. And Jesus was raised up in a nurture and in the admonition of the Lord by His parents. And when He started His ministry. And